Hey guys, what's up? Well, I'm back and welcome back. Okay, today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, maybe not so much focused on this coronavirus, which is a serious thing. And if you're watching this in the future, this is definitely dating the video, but it is a serious thing. And hopefully, with today's video, you'll be able to kind of get your mind off that and focus on some CGI lighting and materials. We're going to mostly be focusing on CGI materials and lighting, but we're kind of just talking about a lot of concepts that computer generated graphics that you need to know when getting into computer generated graphics and non-biased rendering. We're going to specifically be using Redshift for today's video, but these principles will apply in Cycles and in Octane, all render engines you use basically that can physically reproduce light. These principles will apply. I've actually been using Cycles in Blender, and it's pretty fun. It's really interesting. There's some really cool nodes and stuff, but that's totally besides the point. Let's jump into the video and get started. So speaking of lighting, I built this simple scene to kind of demonstrate the principles that we're going to be talking about: reflections, shadows, highlights, caustics, catch lights, bounce lights, everything. We're going to just completely start off with a super basic scene like this so that you can take that fundamental knowledge and apply it to any scene here forth on. So first, let's just talk about lights in general, because that is kind of what this whole thing is based off of, just lighting. So let's jump out of the scene right here. Right now you can see I have just this one big light up here, and if I jump into this view, you can see right here. So notice the shadow and notice the highlight right there. This, for one, is happening because we have this really glossy material. If I take the material right here, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about materials, that's because lighting and materials are linked so closely together, because essentially your materials are behaving as a bounce board all the time, unless you turn your reflection off all the way. It's cool. So let's take this material that I have on this. So if I take the roughness of the sphere right here, and you can see right here the parameter, see how the light starts to diffuse off, and I'll just make this even more obvious and zoom in. When I start dragging here, you can see the light starts to bloom out and kind of just fade slowly. You can see we're starting to get a matte look, and then now you can see it's like over the whole surface, and it kind of the shadows, the highlights and shadows kind of come together more because there's more light being scattered over the surface. So this is with the roughness of 0 and a roughness of 100. And that's just something to keep in consideration. I think reflections, especially out of all these different categories, are super closely linked to lighting and will greatly immensely affect how your lighting looks. So that being said, I said we're talking about lighting, so let's talk about this light right here. First, I want you to watch the shadows, just the shadows in the scene, and what happens when I change the size of this light. So if I go to this area light right here, and I can go to general, and I can change, let's make sure that the light's even first. We'll do 75, 75, cool. And I'll just start scaling the light down. And see how the shadows are kind of sharpening up. So I'll scale it down even more. And now I'll raise the intensity since the light size changed. I guess I could just, I think there's technically a setting for that, like normalized light intensity or something, but we'll just do 1,000. Cool. So we have this really tiny light source. You can see it in our highlights right here. So if you weren't able to read this in your shadows, which is right here, look how much, basically how tight this light got right here. And the shadows are super cut off and super controlled. And that's because we have a small light source. So this is the first thing to consider. Lighting affects your shadow sizes. And you can also see this fall off right here. This terminator point, that's actually like what it's called, has actually sharpened up as well too. And guys, if you don't understand like how it sounds, like this seems really basic and really boring, but this is essential to understand because this will shape how your characters look, how your buildings are. Like for example, if we're doing a building scene and we want this huge cityscape and then all of our shadows are like super broken up, and like for example, if all of our shadows, let's take this back down and let's bump this up. If our shadows are really broken up like this, well, then we're gonna probably realize, oh, hey, something doesn't look to scale right because our lighting's not to scale. Because if you're lighting, for example, an outdoor scene, you want a really small point light because that's the sun. The sun is really small in the sky. Of course, there's a lot of diffusion happening in the atmosphere, which goes under volumetrics, we'll be talking about later. But for the simple start breakdown, if you're going for physically accurate things, you want to match your light sources. So a lot of times if you're doing production videos, production shoots and stuff like that, and you have some CG, like a CG watch, a CG phone or something, you want to match production light sizes to that, and you'll get more realistic shadows. And especially in VFX work, if you're not using HDRIs or if you're adding in lights just to accentuate your HDRIs, this is something incredibly important to understand. Also, along with light size, let's just take this light and let's move it forward and backwards. So when we moved it forward, and it's really hard to tell because the light's super close now, it's super bright. Let's just crank the intensity down. And the exposure, bump that down. So when we moved it forward, you notice that everything softened up because our light source is now closer to our subject. Vice versa, if we move it backwards, you're going to start getting a really directional light, and look at the shadows right there. They've tightened up a lot. So that was like changing our light size, which is also something incredibly important to remember, kind of building your scene to scale. You can see in Cinema 4D right here, I have this character just so I know what scale we're at. Because if you start changing dimensions and start moving on different metric points, like for example, if you want your sphere to be about a foot, and then you want like a light bulb lighting it, but you make that light bulb like 20 times farther away than it's supposed to be because your scene's not at the right scale, well, then you're going to have some big problems and the shadows and stuff aren't going to look right. And especially to someone who's trained in CG, they're going to notice that immediately. Of course, you have the artistic ability to do whatever you want, but we're just talking about physical VFX lighting. We'll get into more artistic things you can do later on. So you might notice I have all these different little kind of labels up here. And this is because materials are so closely linked to lighting. So I kind of got that basic thing out of the way. Let's take off this glossy ball and let's just talk about something that does not emit light or reflects light, and that would be a black hole basically. Cool. So what we have here is a quote unquote black hole. So if we jump into this material right here, and just so you can see everything, it's just a basic material, but I disabled our diffuse material. So if I enable it, you can see now we have our catching light and stuff, but you might notice there's no bouncing coming off of it. And that's because I disabled our reflection. If I take our reflection back up, you now see where we started off at. So you can see our reflection is actually, we're reflecting back the light down here. So what's happening basically is this light's coming down, it's hitting here and reflecting back up, or vice versa, like it's just coming and directly hitting it. If we start to take our reflection roughness down, watch how we start, or just our reflection in general, not even our roughness. And I'm going to jump this on right here so y'all can get it updating super quickly. Watch what happens. Notice how these shadows and highlights on this start to disappear. It almost looks like we're cranking up the roughness, but we're actually just changing our reflection weight. And then when we go down super low, you can see this light starts to disappear completely, even our absolute highlights. So this could really make your scene look flat without having any kind of reflections on your object. So definitely make sure you have reflections. Another thing is, we take away our diffuse. We're basically saying, hey, this object has like no diffuse color or diffuse light. So it's just going to really be made up of reflections from around your scene, which is kind of interesting to see, because then you can see like, okay, I just want to see like what my lights are doing to my object. Turn off your diffuse. And then you can see the reflections and how they're affecting it. So like, for example, we could go to this ground material and say, okay, I don't like how I see too much of it inside of my like on my sphere, or like if you're doing a more complex thing like on your iPhone model or something, we can go ahead and just take the like diffuse of that and turn it down, and you notice how it kind of dropped off on reflection. So using materials to affect other materials, which is also affecting the lighting. Let's go. Great. Let's go back to the black hole material, and I'm just going to turn it back to a black hole so you can kind of understand. So you just see, turn the weight off, turn the reflection rate off. Cool. So you notice, hey, there's no light here. This looks super unrealistic because technically everything reflects light back in some sort of way, at least a little amount, except for, well, black holes, because everything's either emitting or reflecting light if you can see it, except for black holes. The only reason you can see them is because there's literally nothing there and you have the context of all the light around them. So no material really does this, or at least none that I can think of on Earth that does this. So you really don't want to ever disable those two, but that's just something I wanted to show y'all. And you can see how much less dynamic it looks now. It just looks so flat. It's just there like that. So let's move forward to this marble material. I just wanted to make a quick point with this, kind of talk about like how colors can be reflected. So I'm going to go to this ground material, and I'm just going to take the roughness of it down just a bit so we can kind of see this happening a little bit quicker instead of me having to move it around. Cool. I'm going to turn up just a bit more. So you have to consider that the colors of your diffuse object are going to start to affect the colors of the objects that they're reflecting off of. So for example, we have this really orange marble, and let's just go ahead, and I really hope I'm not boring y'all guys, but these principles are so core to forming how you think about the light and how you use it in your scenes effectively. So I know we'll get to the cool stuff later. So let's just take this right here. Cool. And then this is just to exaggerate. So look at this. We have our reflection right here, and you notice it's orange. If I were to change the color of this object, it would become a different color. The reflection would change color, and that's because they're affecting each other. If I were to take the roughness of the ground and turn it up a lot, you'll see the reflection kind of disappear because it becomes more diffuse and it's competing with all this other light. So let's just do that. Remember, when you turn the roughness up on an object, it kind of diffuses all the light across it more evenly. So let's just do that. Look at that. Don't notice any orange. I have to take it back to like where we had it before. You notice some orange, you get the reflection right there, and you can really create dynamic looks by not like completely clamping your roughness all the way up on floors. If you let some reflection come off of it, which a lot of floors usually are reflected because there's coating with like some kind of glossy cleaner, or there's moisture on them. You see how much more dynamic this looks. So we have this right here, and then like how much more dynamic this looks right here. So that's another thing to consider. Reflections, super important, but also the color that they're going to be giving off will affect everything, kind of affect how things look. Cool. Okay, before we jump into caustics, which is everyone's favorite, let's talk about subsurface scattering real quick. And I'm just going to clamp down on here. And there we go. It's not completely noise free, but you kind of are getting the point with it. So basically, what is subsurface scattering? Technically, if we're going to get super technical, guys, all objects have a subsurface scatter because the light is kind of is bouncing within the surface, but like it's so minimal that you would classify them as a diffuse object. So just keep that in mind. I always like to add subsurface scattering to things you might not usually consider, because for me it creates so much more depth and so much more kind of complexity within the object that I'm adding material to. So a lot of times it can kind of give you these cool translucent looks and things like that, or just make the object glow a little bit more. You can notice like this light fall off is a little bit different because we're getting this like glow throughout the object, which is really cool. Which, if we go back to our glossy ball, you notice it's a lot different, just how they look. And this can kind of, the subsurface look, if you nail it right, it can give you some really cool results on things. So of course, like subsurface scatterings it's gonna have reflections. If we check down here, we get some reflections. The color slightly, you can slightly see it down there. So that's just something to consider as well. I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on the subsurface material. I can have so many future videos about it because it's actually probably one of my favorite materials next to like a high reflective material. So yeah, you can get really cool looks with this and really dynamic looks in so many different shades. Look how many different shades of red we have. We have this super bright red that's almost orange, and then kind of falls off into this dark, deep, like almost purple color, which is a beautiful look, and I really like that, and that's why I like subsurface materials. So hey, subsurface materials are there. Cool. So now let's talk about caustics, which are a little bit more confusing, complex, and I can pretty much picture all of these objects in my head, and kind of I know how they'll affect the scene around it. I kind of can just trace in my head, hey, this is how the lighting's going to look. But I'll be honest, caustics is one of the things that is really difficult for me to imagine. If you were to give me an object, I could picture the caustics, but probably not accurately of that object. So let's talk about caustics. And I guess it's okay that I'm not good at them either, because it takes Redshift a lot longer to render, or any render engine, in fact, to render caustics. Cool. So I just made this crazy marble thing, and I gave it a light, and then I had to, and if you're a Redshift user, this is something you have to do. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's automatically enabled in Octane. So you just have to enable caustic photons, and then you have to tell Redshift under visibility, hey, this is visible to GI photons. Sorry, is visible to caustic photons, which are somewhere right here. Visible to caustic photons, which is cool. You want to check that right there. And then you need to go to your final render bucket mode. And then you can see, and I for this specific example, I cranked them up really high in brightness so that you could see them. So look at this. This is also, caustics is something that I really want to explore in the future, because you can get some really dynamic looks out of it. I will say, as far as Octane versus Redshift in this standard goes, I think Octane, if I can't remember correctly, I think it handled them better, but Redshift was faster. I think you have to dial some more stuff in with Redshift to get this look and change some settings, but I'm pretty sure Octane just knocked them out real quick. I never intentionally did anything with caustics in Octane, and this is like, I've done some things with caustics in Redshift, but this is me more like experimenting around in this stage still. I haven't done anything like on a professional production that involved caustics. So yeah, you can just see how beautiful these are, and then you can even like do some crazy stuff. If we go to our material, this is not a material tutorial. I am actually planning on doing like a Redshift class in the future, because I have really dived into the engine, and it's obviously my main engine that I've used on a couple productions, and I'm really into Redshift. I'm really glad I tried it out. It's a little bit more complicated than Octane, but y'all have seen my videos, Redshift versus Octane. I talk about that. Cool. There's some settings like dispersion. If we turn this up, yes, look at this. So now we're starting to get these really cool. And guys, this is why I'm talking so much about materials and lighting, because you can see how closely linked they are. Yeah, so now you're getting this like rainbow prism look, which I couldn't get in Octane. I didn't know how to get that, but in Redshift it's pretty easy, which is cool. Yeah, it's just amazing. I love this look. It's kind of like that Imagine Dragons album cover look. I think people actually did that, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, and we can crank it up like to incredibly insane amounts. And just let it load. Yeah, you can see Redshift's chugging now. Yeah, it's amazing. I just wanted to quickly talk on that, because in the future I want to kind of play with like having that caustic look. You can see like in Blade Runner they really use caustics a lot, which is really cool, and it adds such a dynamic look to your shader and everything, and also to your scenes. So obviously I cranked the caustics up way high for this. I just wanted to kind of play around with it, and this is the most complex thing, because usually with others, subsurface a little bit, it matters on the size of your object, but like this is so incredibly like focused on your geometry and like the angles that it has. Also, like, for example, I think that like the density of your object matters. So like, let's take this cylinder right here and copy it. And then let's scale it down some. I think it would probably affect our photons a lot, because now we have like a volume scattering. And now Redshift's probably super confused because it's dealing with like a scattering within a scatter. Better save this project. It's probably going to kill our render times. The sad thing is I don't think you can really see caustics outside of like the bucket render context, which is pretty sad. But yeah, so like if you're going to work with caustics, just remember, hey, light size, like light size is going to play a big role, light intensity, light spread, and we'll talk about light spread in like 20 seconds, and also the volume and the geometry of the object. Cool. So I just wanted to briefly touch on caustics. This is no way a full in-depth thing of caustics. I literally just threw this together to show y'all caustics. So now here is more of a scene that I'm talking about that's more dynamic, that looks cool. That's a composition actually, where we're applying what we just learned into the scene. So first off, let's address the material. This is a gold material and then I just mapped some different textures and made them random inside of the reflection roughness shader, because I talked about how important reflections were. So I wanted to have a variety of reflections, because in real life you're not going to have like a smooth reflection fall off or anything like that. There's going to be surface imperfections, so keep that in mind. That's more of a material thing, but that still affects your lighting. Cool. So what do we have here? Let me turn off all our lights and our environment fog. So let's talk about the first light. I'm just gonna call it the first light, doesn't really matter. And that's this one. You might have noticed I don't see anything. And if you're really, really observant, you might be able to see, hey, this looks a little weird, because there's no light touching this part of the head, even though the light should be coming from behind camera. So that should be casting some highlights right there and along here. And then also, if you look at these shadows, they're falling off this direction, which where I think the light is, which is behind the camera, that's not the case. So what we're doing here is basically cheating, and this is only something you can do in CG, which is really cool, and you want to be careful with it, because if you do too much of it, you're going to make your scenes look fake, and you have to be very, very careful where you do this. So what we've done here basically is taken the light, and there it is right there, and we just made it invisible. That's basically it. It's not that hard to do. In fact, it's a default in Redshift. I always like to make my lights visible though, because I want to know where they're at, and if I have to make them invisible, I do that with a lot of thought in mind, because that is one of the quickest ways to make your scene look fake. So yeah, keep that in mind. That's our first light, and it's really just there. We talked about highlights earlier. It's really there to stab and just create this sharp punch of highlights on our subject where we want them focusing, which is around the face. And it's also just compositionally, we're creating a bunch of tension, because usually the eyes are attracted to the brightest part of the image first, and we're pulling them down to this bottom corner. And I'm doing this for a series of style frames, and I can talk about that in a future video, but there's a reason I want tension in this image, and that's kind of one of the ways I'm creating it. It's more compositional, but of course lighting is linked to composition, because we're drawing the eyes down to the bottom corner with this luminance. Cool. So let's go ahead and turn on our second light. And it's barely done anything. And to see what it's actually doing, let's turn on our environment fog. There we go. Cool. So it's this blue light, and this is the importance of volumetrics. You can see just by turning on volumetrics how much more depth and how much more, for lack of a better name, I hate it when people say this, but like how much more cinematic it looks. Of course, volumetrics usually are associated with cinema. Almost all films kind of haze up their room before filming, because it softens those highlights and it rolls them off nicely, and it also gives direction to your light, which can be another source of like leading lines and stuff in your composition. So yeah, just with volume, guys, this is an environment, which is a volume. We're getting this awesome scattering look. So yeah, I talked about, we're going to talk about volumes. Well, this is where we're talking about them. You can see it brightens up our scene a lot more. We're able to see more of this, because the volume's actually taking that light and it's kind of it's slowly falling off as it goes because it's getting diffused and broke up and bouncing all around our scene. And now we're getting these really nice like we're getting these accentuations of the subject because we're bouncing this light and kind of reflecting it here, and kind of diffusing it up a little bit. And it's kind of revealing more of our subject versus something like this. And you don't really see that much, and it's not exactly the best look. It is a high contrast look though. You have to consider when you're adding volume, you're going to be taking away some contrast. You can always add that later in post, like with Photoshop or After Effects or Fusion. Just crank up the contrast some. But yeah, just keep that in mind. Don't go crazy on your volume scattering and stuff. It's best to kind of just like keep it realistic because that will give you the most realistic results, which usually look the best in my experience. Cool. Now let's talk about this backlight, which is a new method I'm using to kind of light things. I usually just like change the shape of the light, but I've been doing a lot more mesh lighting because it can give you some really cool results like this. This would be very hard to achieve with a regular light because you can see this interesting fall off we're getting right here. And this is what I was going for in my mind. And this is really, guys, what this is all about. It's about like picturing in your mind and then being able to understand everything technically enough to apply it into like your CG world or even in real life. So yeah, what are we doing here? Well, we're doing something really interesting, which we're taking this torus, and if I just make the light visible real quick, you can understand really what's happening. So let's go here, visible. Cool. So now you're understanding the light source and where it's coming from, and that's how we're getting this really interesting like fall off and accent. And this kind of leads me into our last thing about lighting and what we're really doing. And I've been saying we're lighting the whole time, but technically, like if you really want to think about it, like the best way to think about this and the best way I found to think about lighting is not lighting, but sculpting. So we're actually sculpting what we're seeing on screen. We're shaping it how we want to, whether that be with big soft lights or small harsh lights, or kind of like something in between, or with volume, scattering up, breaking it up, revealing some of the shadows, sculpting some detail into there. Lighting is really complex and it's really intense to think about, but if you just start off by, hey, I'm sculpting my subject right now. How do I want to sculpt it? What kind of story do I want to tell? What kind of language do I want to use when doing this? Do I want a harsh, unforgiving light, or soft, smooth light, or obviously something in between, like I said earlier? So yeah, that's kind of my last piece of advice is, hey, when you're messing with lighting, you're sculpting your scene. And just to show you all the full context of what we have going on here, it's going to slow down redshift a lot, but I kind of to add more depth to the scene, I added more volumetrics in there, in these volume objects, trying to just add more depth, like in the Z axis, but also in the Y and X axis. So you can kind of see them coming in right here, and they're going to take ages to render, so you might not get to see them, but that's just because they're super dense VBDs, and I have a lot of them in the scene. You can kind of see them right here, how we have them kind of creeping up, crawling around, and how they're scattering more light and kind of catching more and adding some more interest to the shot. And it is grounding the shot a little bit, which I wasn't wanting, but I kind of like the look, so I might keep them in. And I'm going to take this in Photoshop and process it. Obviously, this is just a raw linear render, which I do not recommend like ever just going straight from render to final product. Like you definitely have to have some color processing in between, because they just come out, at least in my experience, renders just come out so flat, and you need to add some contrast, some saturation, and then kind of just pull the colors and push them where you want to go. So maybe for a future video, I'll talk about that. But I really hope, guys, that this broadens your kind of understanding of lighting, and hopefully you at least learn something. I'm not just saying stuff you already know, and you're able to apply this to a future project. And remember, guys, a lot of times when you see an amazing render, there's a lot of technical skill involved in everything, but also there's a solid lighting foundation and somehow assisting in the composition or story of that render. So really, as you build your skills, your renders will look better, but you need to also consider lighting to be a big part of where that's going to take you forward. So I encourage you just to do a couple of case studies, a couple of frame studies, and just work on lighting and work on some different techniques with lighting. So with all that being said, guys, thank you for watching. I kind of hope this video helped out. I hope it kind of instructed you in kind of the importance of lighting, because it's not something everyone always thinks about, but it is incredibly important. So guys, thank you for watching. I'll catch you on the next video. Hope this was really helpful. Peace out.